I'll never forget my 3 weeks at St. Gabriel's Hospital. It's been years since I worked there, but the memory still grips me when the night is quiet and shadows seem to move on their own. I'd only been out of nursing school for a few months when I took the job. The midnight shifts were tough, but I'd always prided myself on my resilience, a trait I'd inherited from my mother. That confidence, however, couldn't prepare me for what happened during those 3 weeks. St. Gabriel's was a decrepit old building, the kind of place where the walls seemed to sigh with every gust of wind. It specialized in long-term care, mostly for dementia patients, and many of the residents had been there for years. The hallways were always dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out as you walked past. It felt like the building itself was alive, watching and waiting. That night, I was particularly exhausted. Midnight shifts have a way of twisting time, stretching minutes into hours. My eyelids felt heavy, and I was relying on coffee and sheer willpower to get through. The patients on my floor were unusually restless, their murmurs and occasional cries adding to the eerie atmosphere. One patient, Mr. Hargrove, had been especially agitated. He was in his 70s, a frail man with watery blue eyes that seemed to pierce through you. His dementia often left him confused and frightened, but tonight was different. "He's here again," Mr. Hargrove whispered as I adjusted his blanket. His voice was shaky, but there was a chilling certainty in his tone. "Who's here, Mr. Hargrove?" I asked gently, kneeling beside his bed. "The man in black," he said, his eyes darting to the corner of the room. "He's watching me. He whispers things, terrible things." I turned to look, but the corner was empty. "There's no one there, Mr. Hargrove," I said, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you. Let's try to get some rest." But his hand shot out and gripped mine with surprising strength. "You don't understand," he hissed. "He's not just in here. He's everywhere." I stayed with him until his breathing steadied and he drifted into a fitful sleep. As I left his room, I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was just the drafty hallways, but a part of me couldn't shake the unease. A couple of hours later, I was in the linen closet restocking supplies. The small room was cramped. As I reached for a fresh set of sheets, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It wasn't the usual creaks or groans of the old building. It was something else entirely, like a faint whisper just at the edge of hearing. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, a low murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. Slowly, I cracked the door open and peered out into the hallway. It was empty. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Then I saw him. At the far end of the hallway, standing perfectly still, was a man dressed entirely in black. His suit was old-fashioned, almost Victorian, and his face was pale, a sickly contrast to his dark clothing. But it was his smile that froze the breath in my lungs, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, that grotesque smile never faltering. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed the closet door shut, pressing my back against it. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up to realize this was all a bad dream. When I finally mustered the courage to look again, he was gone. The rest of my shift passed in a haze of fear. Every shadow seemed to twist into his form. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like his footsteps. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion, that Mr. Hargrove's ramblings had gotten into my head. But deep down, I knew better. The next night, I called in sick. By the end of the week, I'd handed in my resignation. I couldn't go back. Whatever was haunting that hospital, it was something far beyond my understanding, something malevolent. I never found out what became of Mr. Hargrove or the other patients. Part of me didn't want to know. Even now, years later, I avoid driving past St. Gabriel's. But sometimes in the dead of night, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I hear whispers or see a figure standing in the corner of my room. And when I look, I swear I catch a fleeting glimpse of that same smile. I've always hated hospitals. The smell of antiseptic, the endless hum of machines, it all sets my teeth on edge. But I didn't have a choice. My therapist insisted I check myself in after my second panic attack in a week. "Just a few days to rest," she had said, "and they'll adjust your meds." The ward wasn't like the horror stories you hear. It was clean, quiet, too quiet. The other patients mostly kept to themselves. I tried to do the same, until... She didn't tell me her name, but I couldn't forget her face. Her skin was pale, almost like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her black hair hung in limp, greasy strands, partially covering eyes that seemed too wide and too dark. She smiled at me in the hallway, her lips thin, her teeth too small, and whispered, "You don't belong here." I stopped walking, unsure if I heard her right. When I turned to ask her what she meant, she was gone. I didn't think much of it at first. A lot of people in here talk to themselves or say strange things. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I heard it. A faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across a wall. At first I thought it was my imagination, a symptom of my anxiety. But then it got louder. I sat up in bed listening for the sound. The sound was coming from the wall behind me. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Then there was a knock. 3 sharp, deliberate taps on the wall. My heart raced. The staff wouldn't take me seriously when I told them the next morning. "It's probably the pipes," the nurse said with a dismissive smile. "Old buildings make weird noises." But I knew it wasn't the pipes. The next night, I decided to keep watch. I propped myself up against the bed's headboard, eyes fixed on the wall. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard the door to my room creak open. I froze. The door hadn't opened all the way, just a crack, but enough for me to see a shadowy figure standing in the hallway. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Who's there?" I whispered. The figure didn't move. I couldn't make out their face, but I saw the glint of those wide, dark eyes through the crack. Then slowly the door started to close again. But before it shut completely, a voice drifted in, soft and chilling. "You don't belong here." I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the 3rd night, I was jumpy, paranoid. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound threatening. I tried to distract myself by reading, but the words blurred on the page. Just as I was about to give up and turn off the light, I heard it again, the scratching. I looked up, and my blood turned to ice. She was there, her body contorted unnaturally, clinging to the wall like a spider. Her head twisted at an impossible angle to face me. Her eyes wide and unblinking, her smile stretched too far across her face. "You don't belong here," she hissed, her voice guttural and wet. I screamed and bolted for the door, but when I threw it open, the hallway was empty. I ran to the nurse's station, babbling incoherently about the woman in my room. They tried to calm me down as 2 of the nurses ran into my room. The contorted girl was another patient who had snuck into my room. Why did this patient find me interesting enough to sneak into my room for the last 3 nights is beyond me. I just hope our paths never cross again. I'd been feeling off for days. At first, it was just a low-grade headache and a mild fever. I chalked it up to stress or a seasonal bug, but by the 4th day I was so weak I could barely sit up. That's when I started hearing her voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper at the edge of my hearing. "Come closer," she would say. I thought it was the TV in the other room, or maybe the fever playing tricks on me. But as the night went on, her voice grew louder. "Come closer," she repeated, insistent, almost desperate. By then, I was too frightened to even move. I reached for my phone and called my husband, who had just left for a night shift. "You need to come home," I croaked. My voice barely sounded like my own. "Something's wrong." He didn't ask questions, just told me he'd be there soon. The minutes dragged on, and so did her voice. "You can't hide from me," she hissed. I swear it felt like she was standing right behind me, but when I turned my head, no one was there. By the time my husband arrived, I was drenched in sweat and shaking. He took one look at me and rushed me to the hospital. The ER was a blur of bright lights, hurried voices, and the sharp sting of needles. I was too weak to protest as they hooked me up to machines and drew vial after vial of blood. When the doctor finally came in, his face was grave. "You're lucky you came in when you did," he said. "Your infection has caused sepsis. If you'd waited any longer..." He trailed off, but I didn't need him to finish the sentence. They admitted me to the ICU for observation, and that's where the dream began. I was in my hospital bed, but the room was darker, the corners shrouded in shadow. I felt a presence near me, the weight of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. When I turned my head, I saw him, my grandfather. He looked just as I remembered, with his kind eyes and weathered face. He reached out and placed a hand on mine, his touch cool but comforting. "You'll be okay," he said softly, "but you need to rest now." I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry and closed. He smiled at me, then stood up and walked into the shadows, disappearing as if he had never been there. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the window. A nurse was adjusting my IV, her face calm and professional. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Better," I murmured, though my body still ached. "Did anyone come to see me last night?" The nurse hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Actually, yes. A man came by around 3 a.m. I thought he was family." My heart skipped a beat. "What did he look like?" She smiled, as if remembering something pleasant. "An older gentleman, silver hair, kind eyes. He said he was your grandfather. He didn't stay long, just said he wanted to make sure you were okay." The room spun around me. "That's impossible," I whispered. "My grandfather's been dead for 5 years." The nurse's smile faltered, replaced by a puzzled expression. "I'm sorry, I didn't know, but he seemed very real. I haven't been able to shake that night. The doctors say the fever could have caused hallucinations, but how do you explain the nurse seeing him too?"